All right, thank you, Cassidy. So here's a little bit more about myself. I am the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator here in Sarasota County at our Extension office. I do a number of programs here, including the Florida Master Naturalist Program, which is what we are going to be talking a bit about today. And I also, my other big program that takes up a lot of my time is the LIFE program, which is Learning in Florida's Environment. It's a program on environmental education for 3rd through 5th graders here in Sarasota County. Because of our current health crisis or situation, we have been videotaping a lot of our LIFE programs. And so if you have kids or grandkids at home, whether they're here in Florida or not, you can find those LIFE videos on our Sarasota County Extension YouTube channel. They're about 12 to 15 minutes long and cover all sorts of nature and science-based topics for that age group. And they're sort of fun. Even if you're an adult, feel free to go to our YouTube channel and watch those. I have a background in environmental studies. That's what my bachelor's degree is from, or is up from SUNY Buffalo in the cold northern climates. And I moved down to Florida over 25 years ago now. So I've been here about a little over half my life. And during that time, I traveled out to Seattle and lived out there for a few years and got my medical degree out there. So that's a little bit about my education. I was a practicing physician for over 10 years, and then about 3.5 years ago decided I wanted to go back to environmental education. And here I am at our extension office, and I get to talk about plants, animals, and nature every day, which I love. Also, I live in a state park, which is an amazing thing. My husband's a state park manager, so we live in Oscar Shearer, which is here in Sarasota County in Florida, with our 2 kids and a whole bunch of animals. So even when I wasn't doing natural resources as a career, I was immersed in them at home. So I often talk about Oscar Shearer because I do have quite a lot of history there, and it has really informed a lot of my own time in the natural resource field. All right, there we go. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sarasota County Extension for those of you that aren't familiar with it. All of our counties in Florida have an extension office. They're all a little bit different based on the needs of the county they're in. Our Sarasota County Extension Office is wonderful and has almost 30 people here ready to assist our community. We're not all here at the moment because of COVID, but we are all working whether we're on site or e-working. So as you can see, we have a number of different program areas. Currently, we're offering our programs virtually. So just like this class, you can find a lot of other classes to register for on Eventbrite in all these different areas, and we have UF faculty, extension agents available to answer your questions in these areas as well. These are some of the programs that we do through our office. So on the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the logo for the UF IFAS Florida Master Naturalist Program. And that is, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The county likes me to remind all of us to please take the census if you haven't. It's really important. It helps provide funding to a variety of organizations and programs in our community. So you can do it online at census.gov. So please feel free to go and do that if you haven't filled out your census yet. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what we're all here for today. We are here for the Florida Master Naturalist Freshwater Core Module Preview. So what that means is I'm going to take about a 40-hour class that we normally spread out over many, many, many days, and I'm going to condense it into this hour today. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time. This is the first time I've done this one. I've got way too many slides and a ton of information that I would love to share with you, and some of it will probably go through pretty quick because I just don't have enough time in an hour to cover all of the slides. I think we're scheduled for about an hour and a half, but I want to leave some time at the end for you guys to have question and answer time as well. If you don't want to forget your question while I'm talking, because I can't see your questions pop up in the chat box, Cassidy is going to be monitoring that, and I will answer your questions at the end. But go ahead and put your question into the chat box so you don't forget it as I move on to other topics. We are going to try to cover a lot of stuff today. I'm going to try to do an overview of our Florida's freshwater ecosystems. I'm going to talk about the 3 main freshwater habitats that are covered in our Florida Master Naturalist class. I decided I was going to try to focus then some time on adaptations of plants and animals in the freshwater environment, because all plants and animals develop adaptations over time to the habitat or environment they live in. And to me, that's really fascinating. That's what makes all of these different living organisms so unique and different from each other. And it also really is just exciting and fun to look at, okay, well, this plant lives in a very wet environment and maybe the soils are very nutrient deficient in that environment. So how has it learned to adapt to be able to live in that environment? So we're going to look at some of those fascinating and fun facts. Then I'll talk to you just briefly about more about the Florida Master Naturalist program. For those of you, I'd be interested to know how many people are on the call that have taken a Master Naturalist class. And it doesn't have to be here in Sarasota County, it could be anywhere in the state. So if you've taken a Florida Master Naturalist class, you can raise your hand by going, usually there's a toolbar down at the bottom of your screen. And Cassidy, I can't see it because I'm screen sharing. Can you tell them how to find their little raised hand thing at the bottom of their screen?
Yes. Just give me one moment to find it as well.
It's usually under reactions, but everybody's device is a little bit different, so.
I know with reactions, you can definitely give us a thumbs up. Yes, thank you, Stephen. It is under participants somewhere.
Thank you.
I'm not sure where. Thank you for that.
All right, well, if you can find it, I don't want to waste our time, but if you can find it and you've taken a Master Naturalist class, go ahead and give us a thumbs up or raise your hand or whatever works, or you can type your name into the chat box and then we'll know later. So I'm thinking probably a number of you might be new to the Florida Master Naturalist program. So if you are, you're going to learn more about it towards the end. And then I will also share some photos from some of the classes we have taught in the past. I usually co-teach the freshwater core module with Dr. Abby Turna, who is our water resources agent here at our office. And she is a wetlands biologist, so she really knows wetlands and really knows a lot of the science. So she is a fabulous resource to have as a co-educator for this class. All right, so let's move on without further ado. So Florida, of course, is a long flat peninsula and it's not very high. We don't have a very high elevation here. And roughly our highest elevation is about 300 feet above sea level usually in the middle of our state along that Lake Wales Ridge are where some of the higher points are in our state. So we are a pretty flat state. In many areas of our state, the water table is very close to the surface. And so even small changes in elevation can have profound effects on both soil moisture and water accumulation. And of course, this can lead to the formation of wetlands, and then wetland plants will inhabit that environment and in turn will provide habitat for the animals that will frequent those types of habitats. And we're going to talk about both plants and animals today. Some of the important physical factors that influence wetlands include hydroperiod, which means that's just a fancy scientific word for how long the soils are wet, soil characteristics, and various disturbances like fire. So we're going to see that one type of common wetland here in Florida is really influenced by fire, and another type isn't as much. So I want to take you on just a little historical visual journey of an area here in Sarasota County. I don't know if we may have people joining from other counties in Florida, or maybe even from other places than Florida. But I'll talk you through these. And for those of you that are in Sarasota County, this is the Palmer Ranch area back in 1948. So like 70 plus years ago, when there weren't as many of us here, as we can see from this aerial. What you're seeing is, let me move my cursor, this road along the left side of your screen is Tamiami Trail. This is the old railway, which is now the Legacy Trail. And this way up here in the upper right of your screen is Clark Road, or Route 72, that goes out to Myakka River State Park and then continues on to Arcadia, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. And we're going to end up looking at, we're going to enhance just this area that's in the box in just a moment on the next slides. But when you look at this picture, you can really see how wetlands are such a rich part of our environment and our history here in Florida, and obviously in Sarasota County. All of those dark circular areas are natural wetlands. And you can see that a lot of them look very circular, and many of those would be depression marshes that were formed where there's just a small, sometimes just barely inches of change in elevation that allow water to collect. So let's look at what happens over time. So we're going to zoom in on just that box right there. So here we are, and I've zoomed in, and so cutting the screen in half basically is the Legacy, what is now the Legacy Trail, what was then a railroad. And we have highlighted with these circles some of these natural wetlands. So this is still 1948. So now the orange circles are still highlighting those natural wetlands, but we have added in, and these slides were done by Dr. Abby, my co-teacher for this class. So she put these highlights in. The yellow highlights are the drainage patterns that are now currently being used, and then you see some of the channels that were developed in those blue lines that look like rivers. Just one second, Cassidy, if you can mute people as they come in, that would be great. Then we're going to jump forward. So here's 1995. Yep. So 1995. We still are circling the wetlands, but notice how they look different. They are much more dried up because they are being drained by some of these drainage canals that were created. And now here are some of the best called storm retention ponds that have been put in so that people can have what we like to call lakefront property, although it's really a storm water retention pond that either wasn't naturally there or might have been part of the naturally occurring drainage patterns that were then enhanced to further drain some of the naturally occurring wetlands that we still have circled here in orange. So you can really start to see the changes that occur with development. You know, if we go back, I'm going to go back, sorry. This is always fun when you're in Zoom to go back a bunch of slides. So if we go back to our very first slide where we're looking at quite a large area of Palmer Ranch in Sarasota County, look at all of those wetlands. This is a wonderful place to develop, except that there's just a lot of water. So if this area wants to be developed, then drainage has to occur so that these houses have dry ground to be built upon. So we're seeing here on the left-hand side a community that was developed in the 90s, and then here we are in 1999, where we have both sides of the Legacy Trail now developed. We continue to see changes in the wetlands as they become drier. Notice they're grayer, the wetlands that are circled in orange. They are grayer. Find my cursor, here we go. They are grayer now. This indicates that they are dried out more, and that central redder area is the area that still has a little bit of actual standing water in there. And so here's what we're looking at in 2002. This is the Deer Creek and Turtle Rock communities. You can see how much development has occurred. You can see how the wetlands have transitioned, and now outlined in yellow are the drainage features that have been put in to drain the naturally occurring wetlands so that the communities can be developed. This is McIntosh Road here, so we also see more roads that have been built, which also affects our wetland areas as well. So we see McIntosh Road on the left. We see Central Sarasota Parkway along the bottom here. Honore Avenue is on the right. And then this is the Legacy Trail that now divides these two communities and is a wonderful place to hike and bike through Sarasota, but we're really seeing the difference that development can make. So now that we've had our little historical tour of an area in Sarasota County, let's talk a little bit more about wetlands. These are factors that influence wetlands. So we've mentioned the hydro period already, or the amount of time that the land stays wet. Topography, so obviously elevation is going to influence it. Soil type, fire, we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and climate. Those are physical factors. Biological factors are things like non-native plants. So these are plants that have been brought into an area that weren't historically there. Some of them do become invasive, and we are going to talk about invasive plants and animals towards the end as well. And these can really affect the ecology of the wetland area. Some of our non-native invasive plants will actually create what's called a monoculture. Some of them rapidly utilize water, so they might actually dry up the wetlands. Excessive grazing can be an issue, and then human activities, of course, as we just saw in the previous slides, or even something like four-wheeling through a wetland area, of course, is going to affect the health of that ecosystem. And I think it's interesting to look at value and how we perceive value. So from a monetary perspective, there's a huge economy here in Florida based around recreation and tourism that isn't just beaches. Beaches is obviously our #1 recreation draw here in Florida, and of course our theme parks are a tourism draw as well. But wildlife is also a big driver of our economy here. So here are some numbers from about 10 years ago. $144.7 billion was spent on wildlife recreation in the US, and in Florida, $9 billion was spent on wildlife related activities. And that has to do with fishing, it has to do with birding. We have some really lovely birding hotspots in Florida, even here in Sarasota County, the celery fields, for instance, and many other types of just wildlife watching or interaction. And then of course, there's another type of value besides what we automatically think of, which is money. There's a huge value to wetlands in what we call ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are things that these wetlands provide for us and the environment. So they help reduce erosion, they improve water quality. They basically are like a sponge, and they hold water which can retain floodwaters and help mitigate flooding. But also by doing that, they act as a filter for the water as well. So that helps to filter impurities out of the water and improve water quality as it filters down into our aquifer. So they also recharge aquifers. and they sequester carbon. So they hold some of that carbon from being released and emitted into our atmosphere. And of course, wetlands are just important in terms of aesthetics and quality of life. I will tell you that during this COVID time, for about the first 8 weeks of it, I spent one day every weekend out on the water kayaking. And I don't really love to kayak along our coastal area, which is where I think a lot of people kayak here in Sarasota County. I really prefer to kayak in some of these freshwater areas. And it was some of the most beautiful kayaking that I have been in, some of the trips that we took those first couple months, just trying to go outside somewhere safe. So go out and enjoy those wetlands. Some other benefits of wetlands is, of course, they support a rich and complex food web. There are many plants and animals that inhabit wetlands and are either obligate wetland plants and animals, meaning they need to spend their life in the wetland or in the water, or they're facultative. I always have a hard time with that word. I want to say faculty. They're facultative wetland plants and animals. And that means that they spend part of their life in the wetlands, and they may also be found in more of the upland areas as well. They don't need to have the wetlands, but the obligate organisms do. And here's just an example of the complexity of a freshwater wetland food web. Food webs, and that's why we started calling them food webs instead of food chains, because a food chain indicates sort of a linear arrangement of predator and prey, but nothing in nature really is linear and simplistic. It is a complex, interactive ecosystem. And so as you can see here, there's decomposers, producers, and consumers, and they're all interlinked in this complexity. And we all understand that how interconnected this is, and that if you pull one organism out of this food web, it basically like pulls on all of those other connections and can have dramatic impacts on our ecosystem. All right, so let's talk about herbaceous wetlands. So we're going to talk about our 3 main wetland ecosystems. Now we're going to focus mostly on herbaceous wetlands, which we also call marshes, and then more of our woody wetlands, which we call swamps. So let's learn a little bit about marshes. Marshes tend to form in depressions in the landscape, like those depression marshes that I was mentioning when we looked at the aerial photograph. And marshes are dominated by herbaceous vegetation, which means like the soft green sort of plants, not the woody plants like trees. And herbaceous wetlands are maintained by fire. So this is where we're going to end up talking a little bit more about the importance of fire, especially to this type of wetland. And here's just an example. So all the different areas that are stippled or dotted here are the herbaceous wetlands in Florida. You can see that really herbaceous wetlands are much more common in the southern part of Florida. Obviously, the Everglades is a huge wetland. So we see that really identified here in this map. Herbaceous wetlands get less common as you go further north. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between vascular and non-vascular plants. We'll look at some of these terms: emergent, submergent, and floating. And then of course soils have, this is basic soil terminology. Saturated just means it cannot hold any more water, and then it goes down the scale from really, really wet to dry as you read those words. So saturated is really, really wet. Full of water, the soil is not going to be able to hold any more water. And then hydric is wet, mesic is sort of in the middle, and xeric is dry. So when you see some of these words, that's what you're thinking about in terms of a scale from more wet to less wet and more dry. And then succession is an ecological term that's really important when we talk about these herbaceous wetlands, these marshes. If fire does not go through these marshes as it historically would have in our state before there was a lot of development, and of course, once there was a lot of development and people here and buildings that were important to us, then we started to suppress the naturally occurring lightning strike fires that would normally have set fire to large portions of Florida during our stormy season. So in order to save our structures, we suppress a lot of fire. And what happens if you suppress fire going through some of these natural areas like our herbaceous marshes is that then you have succession. That herbaceous marsh will start to change. It will succeed into the next stage. And for herbaceous marshes, usually the next stage is our trees starting to encroach in, a little bit of drying of the area, and then more and more trees will creep in, and suddenly you have a swamp and you no longer have a marsh. So fire helps to maintain these marshes, just like it helps to maintain some of our upland plant communities like scrub and pine flatwoods. So many of these ecosystems in Florida are fire dependent and have grown and adapted with fire over thousands and thousands of years. And so when we remove that fire, then our ecosystems start to change. So once again, this is just such a beautiful picture. Herbaceous wetlands are dominated by these green, non-woody plants, and they're very influenced by the things we just mentioned. So let's talk about adaptations of wetland plants. There are some really, really interesting things that wetland plants do and have evolved over time in order to live in this really, really wet area. The selective pressures are some of the things that basically select out plants with certain characteristics that are able to live in this type of environment that is really wet, that is influenced by fire, that has these specific soil and water chemistry and characteristics. And herbivory refers to animals, of course, eating plants. So plants have also adapted to try to survive being eaten by those animals. So some of the common adaptations are the shapes of the leaves. And some of these wetland plants are going to have waxy coatings and other types of adaptations to help them retain water during the drier seasons, and also help them to compete for light and photosynthesize. As I mentioned before, some of these plants are in very nutrient deficient soils because the soils are so wet and they're constantly, the water is constantly filtering through some of these soils, and therefore the nutrients often filter through these soils relatively quickly. And so we're going to talk about carnivorous or insectivorous plants in a minute, and those are really unique adaptations that allow those particular plants to eat an insect and get some of its nutrients from the insect that it's not able to get from the soil like most plants would. Rhizomes are an underground modified root structure that allow the plant to reproduce without having sexual reproduction, without having a flower. So many of these plants do have flowers and can reproduce sexually, but rhizomes allow another opportunity for reproduction by traveling underground and then sprouting another plant just a little bit away. Rhizomes are also a great adaptation for fire-dependent plants or plants in a fire-dependent landscape, because if a fire goes through, it might burn the above ground parts of the plant, but if that plant has an underground rhizome, once the fire goes through, it can just sprout another plant a little ways away. Many of our plants that we find in wetland areas will have different seed dispersal strategies So for instance, some of the seeds will be dispersed by wind, and some of them will be dispersed by water. And then in terms of the herbivory defense, some of these plants will have certain chemical constituents that they make in their structure that taste really bad to animals, for instance, so that animals are less likely to eat them. So cool how all these different organisms create all these different adaptations to survive. And here's just our look at when we're in a deeper wetland with standing water, we often will have emergent, floating, and submergent plants. So this is another adaptation strategy for survival, to resource partition. So, you know, emergent plants are going to take up the area along the shoreline or the littoral zone. Whereas submerged plants are going to be able to utilize the resources in the deeper part of the wetland. So resource partitioning just allows all these different organisms, whether they're plants or animals, to try to sort of grab an area of the environment that they can utilize the resources from. So they're not all competing for the same resources in one area. Really interesting to me is these non-vascular plants. So non-vascular plants are really primitive and they do not have vessels or vascular tissue. So if you think about like your pretty flowers that are probably growing out in your yard right now, or maybe you have some vegetables in a garden, or maybe you have a tree outside your window, those are all vascular plants. They're all larger plants. They have what we call xylem and phloem, which are like arteries and veins in us. The xylem and phloem in plants help to transfer water and nutrients throughout the larger structure of those larger plants. They also provide structure and stability so that those plants can sort of stand up above the ground. Whereas our non-vascular plants are very small, and they do not have these vessels that transport water and nutrients throughout their structures and their cells, and they don't really have the ability to sort of stand up above ground. So when we talk about non-vascular plants, we're talking about things like algae and mosses, and they're going to absorb water and nutrients directly from their environment. So here is an example, some periphyton or algae. And these types of plants play a really important role in our wetlands. So they are the basis of our wetland food web. So they are going to photosynthesize and provide food to our consumers. And they're also an ecological indicator of health of our wetlands. So although you may look at that and you may think, oh, there's something wrong with that, there actually isn't. This type of algae here is really important periphyton. Of course, we can have harmful algal blooms, which is a totally different thing. All right, we're going to look at some plants. These are some of our vascular plants: grasses, sedges, and rushes. And I'm just going to say, I'm going to start to speed up now and show you some pictures and sort of just say a couple words about each slide. But grasses, sedges, and rushes are difficult things to learn to identify. I feel like I'm in my infancy still after decades of being a naturalist. It is still really hard to learn your grasses, sedges, and rushes. And guess what compounds that difficulty? They name them incorrect things when they give them their common names. So for instance, star rush, it's not a rush. So muley grass is actually a grass, but our common names often confuse us. So sawgrass also is not a grass, it's a sedge. So here we have a grass that's actually named a grass, and then two things that are named incorrectly in their common names for what they are. So there's a really good rhyme. I'm trying to find my notes here because I have a hard time remembering it all the way through. So here's our rhyme. Sedges have edges. So if you feel their stem, it actually has edges on it. Sometimes it's actually even triangular. let's see, sedges have edges, rushes are round. So if you feel the stem of the rush, it's actually circular. And grasses have nodes all the way down. So if it's a grass, it has little nodes all the way down its stem, with like little separating characteristics along the stem. So that's a generalized rhyme that can help you with identification, but realize that our common names are sometimes incorrect and misleading, which is why we have these really complicated, fancy scientific names, which scientists and botanists use all over the world to identify a very specific species. So sometimes we have to start looking at some of those individualized characteristics and our scientific names if we want to learn these grasses, sedges, and rushes, which are main herbaceous components of our wetlands. Ferns also can be found in our wetland areas. We do have both epiphytic and terrestrial ferns, and many of our ferns need to be in more of our wetter wetland environments because part of how they reproduce is through spores that need the male and female gametes to find each other through water. So they sort of swim to each other in a moist environment. So you're generally going to find the majority of our ferns in Florida in moister environments. These I just included because I see them in so many of our wetland preserves here in Sarasota County. The one on our left, I tend to call bachelor buttons, is another common name for it. And there's a number of different species of bachelor buttons here in Sarasota, as well as hat pins, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And they often occur together, the bachelor buttons and the hat pins, and they're just really unique characteristics. Their flowers are just very unusual. They don't look like a traditional flower. So if you see anything that looks like these, you're probably in an area that stays moist for a decent percentage of the year. And then here's our insectivorous or carnivorous plants. These are just so unique and interesting when you come across these. I will say the place I've been in Sarasota County where I've seen these, there's some depression marshes in both Myakka River State Park that have a large population of some of these carnivorous plants. And then I've seen a few in Oscar Shearer wetlands as well. And there's probably other places, other wetlands in Sarasota County. These pink sundews are really, really, really tiny. So they're hard to see because they're down on the ground. They're only, I mean, they're not even as big around sometimes as my palm. But once you spot them, you start seeing them all throughout the depression marshes. And as you can see by looking at them, they have these little special modifications that are sort of sticky so that when an insect does land on them, the insect gets stuck just like it would get stuck in a spider's web. And then these carnivorous plants have special digestive juices or enzymes that then break down the body of that insect and extract the nutrients from it that they're not able to always get from the soil in these nutrient deficient environments. So super cool adaptation. All right, so let's talk about forested wetlands or swamps. So these are going to be wetlands that are dominated by trees that are capable of having their feet wet for a percentage of time. And generally we characterize swamps as having more than a third woody growth. Whereas our marshes are going to have less than a third woody growth. So there's obviously going to be some crossover or gray area between a marsh and a swamp, especially if we are starting to see succession because the marsh has not had a fire go through it and trees are starting to encroach. So, you know, there's obviously some gray area here, but your swamps are going to be typically more wooded. And I always think of, if you've been to Fakahatchee or Corkscrew Swamp, and you've seen the big cypress trees with the big buttresses at the base of their trunks and their cypress knees. That to me is like a classic Florida swamp. Of course, there's swamps throughout Georgia and Louisiana too, so maybe you've visited some of those. So our forested wetlands or swamps are often a climax community, meaning they're sort of what the other wetlands will succeed into. And if a fire does go through a swamp, it often can be very devastating and destructive. So generally there's infrequent fire in swamps. If there was a fire that went through a swamp, it might actually cause the swamp to sort of go back to being a marsh, as some of those trees would be lost. So here are our distribution of freshwater swamps in Florida. Swamps in our state tend to be more common in the north, but of course the two I just mentioned, well, big cypress, Fakahatchee, and Corkscrew, the big three are down here on the northern edge of the Everglades, but then you can see swamps are much more common as we get further north. So we already mentioned most of these things that are characteristic of forested wetlands or swamps, but epiphytes are something that are also commonly found here, because epiphytes are going to live on trees and they have special adaptations to take moisture out of the air. So they are often going to be found on those trees in very humid areas. And of course, you need to have that wet sort of environment to have a lot more humidity than the average Florida humidity, which for us humans is plenty. So here are some of the adaptations of the wooded plants in our swamp. So there's a great picture of cypress there. You see, we call that buttressing, that widening of the base of the cypress tree, and that's to help provide stability. So if that tree has its feet or its roots in the water for a large percentage of the year, that soil may not provide a lot of stability. So we think these buttressing helps to support the tree in those damp soils. And then the leaves of the plants in this environment often have specific adaptations to help them retain water. They can have tannins in them, which are sort of a bitter substance that can protect them from being eaten by animals. And once again, they're going to have seed dispersal adaptations that help their seeds to move beyond where the parent plant is and into other places in the environment. So here are two cypresses that are here in Florida. In our area, well, cypress is not as common in our area in Sarasota County, although you will see them in some of the wetter areas. I know they've been planted, for instance, in some areas along 75 where there's sort of like a drainage ditch, and so there's an area that collects water, and sometimes the cypress do well there and sometimes not. There is a cypress head in Myakka River State Park that I believe was planted and was not a natural, like not naturally occurring there, but it is doing fine there. Sometimes we take our students to walk through it in our freshwater class. So in our area, if you see a cypress, it's more likely to be the bald cypress, but there's also in Florida the pond cypress. And really one of the main ways to tell them apart is the needles. You can see the bald cypress has sort of long flat needles, whereas the needles of the pond cypress are small and really they're almost like curled up and tight against the stem or branch there. And here in the bottom left, those are what we call the cypress knees that often accompany the cypress trees. Here are a couple of wetland trees that like to have their feet wet. The red maples are generally, we're right in Sarasota County at the the southern edge of the range. So the red maples are going to be a little bit more north, but they will do okay here if they're in a wetland area. And then our red bays are common here in Sarasota County, although many of them are dying due to a disease that has been introduced by an invasive beetle. But our red bays also like to be in wetter areas. And then our willows, the Carolina willow on your right-hand side, whenever I see a willow, and once you get to know the willow, I can identify them as I'm driving down Route 75 going the speed limit at 70 miles per hour. I can identify those willows because they have like sort of a lighter green leaf, and they have a certain sort of way that they grow, and they like to be in those ditches along 75, but they also can form what we call willow heads, where they will be the dominant plant the dominant woody plant in a swamp. Our Virginia willow is not a true willow species. You can see the different genus name there, Itea. So it's actually not a true willow, but it looks like a willow, and it is found in wetland areas too. There are a couple of walks on some of our Sarasota County preserves that specifically go out to try to find this type of plant, this Virginia willow, because they have amazing blooms that are sort of like these big long sprays of white flowers that just have a very powerful scent. And we do have some of them on our county preserves. You can see here at the bottom right, those are the more smaller blooms of the Carolina willow, which are not as showy and not as smelly either. So not as exciting to find those flowers. We will also find wax myrtle and cabbage palms in wetland areas. If you've been to Myakka River State Park, you know that cabbage palms are very dominant there in some of the wetter areas. Wax myrtle we have throughout our entire county. And wax myrtle is the plant that the pioneers and the Native Americans would collect tons, and I mean tons, of these little berries that you see in that picture. The berries are really tiny, and you have to collect a whole lot of them, and then you boil them, and they do have a resinous, waxy component to the berries that will then float to the top of the water that you can strain off and make candles. But it's a labor of love because you have to really have a lot of those berries. And let's talk a little bit about our air plants or our epiphytes. So here are a couple of them that are common in our area. Our cardinal air plant is not as common anymore because it is also being attacked by a different invasive insect that sort of eats out the core of some of our larger bromeliads so that they cannot survive. So really exciting epiphytes. We have so many different epiphytes here in Florida that you're not going to see in a lot of other areas and regions in our country, and they are going to be more in these wet, warm, very humid, swampy type areas. We have some epiphytic ferns as well, like the resurrection fern. One of these special adaptations is that the resurrection fern, when we're not in rainy season, or if we've gone a few days without rain, it will dry up, it'll turn brown, it'll wither up, it'll totally look like it's dead. But then the next time it rains, it's able to just suck up the moisture and resurrect itself, which hence its common name. And it'll be this brilliant emerald green throughout our swampy wetland areas. A lot of these epiphytes will also like to be on our large live oak trees because that live oak bark is really creviced and provides a nice place for them to sort of grab hold. Our strap fern on the right, that's going to be found more in like the areas that I think of, like the corkscrew swamp. A lot of times you'll find these large strap ferns on old cypress trunks and like logs that have come down, and the strap ferns will grow there. And then we have epiphytic orchids as well. Our greenfly orchid tends to be a little bit north, like from Manatee County north, but our butterfly orchids are really common in southern Florida, and we can see these in a lot of our swampy wetland areas. All right, so as I knew, I'm really running out of time because I knew I had way too many fun things to tell you guys about. So I'm gonna skip over springs, rivers, and lakes for the most part. Springs are a really exciting feature of Florida. We have more springs than any other state in our country, and they are so unique. They tend to be more in central Florida. So you can come and take our class and we'll teach you all about them. But ready? I'm going to skip over this whole area really quick. Okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about animals. I'm going to skip some of these, but we'll talk about a few of them. So our invertebrates are animals that don't have a backbone. That's basically the definition of an invertebrate. And we have a lot of aquatic invertebrates that inhabit our freshwater sources. And this cute little graphic just gives you a whole bunch of really common ones. And they have all sorts of different adaptations that help them survive. They have different mouth parts that many of these are predators. Some of them will hunt along the top of the water, like you see up here. Some of them are diving beetles and can dive below the surface to hunt for food. Just all sorts of really unique characteristics. And many of these also are indicators that we call them biological indicators of the health of our freshwater ecosystems. So when we teach the class, we always do a dip netting exercise where we take the students out to a freshwater source. We do some dip netting. We show them how to use the D-ring, which are more the scientific dip nets. And we pull a bunch of these organisms out of the water. We look at them under the microscope. We identify them. And then depending on the types and the diversity of organisms we find will often be indicative of how healthy that pond or lake is. So that's a fun activity that we do here. I'm going to show you some pictures of a few of them. Here's some of our beetles. The whirligig beetles are the ones that sort of whirligig all on top of the water. Our predaceous diving beetles will dive under the water, carry a little bubble of air with them. Here's the larval form and the adult form of a dragonfly. Both of them are predators, so they will eat other types of invertebrates. So fish, I'm just going to show you a couple slides on fish because fish are not my specialty area at all, but I find it very fascinating the different types of adaptations that some of these animals have. For instance, many of our animals, whether they're fish or birds or mammals, will have specific adaptations based on what they eat. So as you can see here, you can look at a fish, and if it's me and I pull a fish out when we dip net, I can't identify it because I don't really know much about fish. We have somebody else that does that part. But what I can start to do, because really the name is nice to know and it helps you learn more about an organism, but if we start looking at their parts and their features on their body, even if we can't name a fish or a bird or an insect, we can start to learn a lot about them by trying to figure out their adaptations of their features. So this is just a little slide that shows you that fish with different mouth parts, they eat different things and their mouths are adapted specifically to where and how and what they eat. And then same with fish tails. There's all different sort of structures or features of fish tails dependent on how the fish swim, how they hunt for food, how they need to get away if they happen to be prey. So these all help determine what types of swimmers they are and what they do. There's behavioral adaptations for fish. Of course, many of our animals have specific colors that either help them to be camouflaged or help them to attract mates, and that is same for fish as well. Some of our fish even have venomous spines and can be poisonous. And then I'm not even going to try to say all these words, but depending on how they lay their eggs, those are also adaptations that have evolved over time so that they can reproduce more effectively. So our plants and animals have all of these different reproductive strategies so that they can continue their species. And you can see many of our fish lay eggs in all different ways, but they also, some of our fish are live bearing as well, or viviparous. Here's a slide that indicates resource partitioning. We saw some resource partitioning with plants, and now we see some of the plants in here, but we also see how fish will also inhabit different places in the water column and sort of partition resources based on just where they tend to live. Okay, let's talk about amphibians for a second. Amphibians, that translates as double life because they have a life cycle that is in some way dependent on water for most or all of their life cycle. And they also can live on land, and they have very distinct larval and adult phases, like a tadpole and then a frog, for instance. They have numerous other features that have developed as adaptations to their watery environment that they spend a majority of their lifetime in. And then look at, I thought this was just really cool, look at the different sort of foot and toe arrangements of frogs. And of course, this is going to have developed over time based on where they live. So tree frogs are often going to be arboreal, living up in the trees, and they're going to have those wide toes with the sticky pads that help them navigate their arboreal environment. Our bullfrog, like a duck, has a webbed hind foot because it is spending a lot of time down lower in watery environments. And then our toad looks also very different because our toads tend to be more terrestrial and tend to be in the drier areas. So 40% of amphibians are threatened worldwide. You know, they need to be in wet areas because their skin needs to be damp and they diffuse oxygen through that damp skin. So as they lose wetland habitats, they're just not able to adapt to other types of habitats to survive. Their skin is also very sensitive to pollutants. Here's some of our true frogs. So there's our bullfrog and our southern leopard frog. And then our tree frogs, here's an example. This is actually from one of our freshwater classes. This is a pine woods tree frog where we took the class out and we did a diversity experiment where we used PVC piping to sort of, we're not really capturing the frogs because they can come and go as they please, but they sort of like to be inside a PVC pipe. It's a safe area for them. It often retains moisture and it's sort of dark and cool. So if you put PVC pipes out, then often frogs, especially tree frogs, will come into them. And so we did an array of PVC pipes from more of an upland habitat into a wetland in Oscar Scherer State Park. And of course, when you're on conservation land, publicly owned land, you need to have permits to do this. So this was a permitted experiment that we did. And we had 4 pipes more in the upland area and then 4 pipes transitioning into the wetland area. In the upland area, we found these pine woods tree frogs, and there's this close-up picture of the inside of the tree frog's thigh because that's how you specifically identify this kind of tree frog. is it has these yellow dots on its femoral area. So that's really fun. This is how tiny this tree frog is, and we had to like very carefully, so we didn't hurt him. We had to look at the inside of its thigh to see what type of frog it was. And then here are some of our toads, our southern toad, and then our oak toad is our smallest toad in Florida. The bullfrog is our largest native frog in Florida, the one we looked at earlier. So there's some of our amphibians. Our reptiles, skulls are always really interesting to look at because the teeth structure of whether it's a reptile skull or a mammal skull, when we look at the skulls and the teeth especially, can help us really understand what the animal eats and how it eats. So of course that venomous snake up there in the right hand upper corner, you can really see the fangs that will inject the venom. Our American alligator, that really strong, heavy skull and jaw with those teeth. So this really informs us of how the animals have adapted over time based on their food sources. And of course, if you live in Sarasota County, you've probably seen an alligator. Because they're in every county in the state of Florida, and there's plenty of them here in Sarasota, especially if you go out to Myakka River State Park and do some sightseeing. The crocodiles are going to be less common here. They're more likely to be in southern Florida. You don't see them as often. They tend to keep to themselves a little bit more, and there's less of them compared to alligators. So if you're here in Sarasota County, what you've probably seen is an alligator. All right, I'm gonna go through the birds really quick. We love to talk about freshwater birds in our life program. We do a specific video and program just based on freshwater birds because they have so many unique adaptations. Their beak and their feet are very adapted to what part of the environment they live in. So sometimes we sort of divide birds up and talk about them based on some of their characteristics, like we see on this slide here. I'm going to talk about just a couple. So here's some very common diving birds that you are likely to have seen if you're here in Sarasota. And the cormorant and anhinga can sometimes look alike from a distance, and they both will swim in the water and then dive to catch fish. The anhinga, which is the one on the right, has a very long, narrow beak and will dive and sort of do a short burst of activity and try to spear a fish. Whereas our cormorant has a shorter bill, but it actually has a little hook on it. So they will more try to grab fish. And sometimes we'll even grab them and then toss them up in the air. So even though they are living in the same environment, they have the same type of prey, they have different adaptations to help them catch their prey in different ways. Ducks have really cool beaks. They actually, we have a better picture we should put on this slide where you can see the beak close up, and they have these things called lamellae, and lamellae are along the edge of the upper and lower part of the beak, and they look like little teeth, but they aren't because most ducks are mostly herbivores, and they eat grasses and other wetland aquatic plants. So they are often eating the plants from under the water though. So I think of it as my spaghetti strainer at home. These duck beaks have these little lamellae so that when they stick their heads underwater and grab a big mouthful of plants, which is also a big mouthful of water, when they bring their head up, the lamellae are like spaghetti strainers that they allow the water to strain out of their beaks so that they just get a nice, delicious breakfast of plants. And during our class, we have a lot of skull replicas of many of these different types of birds. So we actually pass those around, we look at them, we see all of these unique features that we're talking about. Here's our heron and egret examples. These are some of our wading birds. They have those long legs that help them wade through the water as they're looking for fish that they then are going to spear with their long beaks. Compared to our roseate spoonbill and our wood stork, these guys are so neat. They're called tactile feeders. And what that means, tactile means touch. So they are not so much going to use their sense of vision to look for their food. They are going to stick their beaks into the water, sort of partially open. They're going to swing their head from side to side so that their beak moves through the water. That's going to stir up crustaceans and little fish and things like that that they want to eat. And they have these specialized nerve cells in their beaks so that as soon as something swims through and touches the inside of their beak snaps shut and they have their breakfast. So these tactile feeders have their own specific adaptation to be able to eat in these watery environments that sometimes are murky and stirred up and they can't see their food very well. And our mammals. Once again, we can look at these skulls and we can start to figure out, well, what adaptations do predators or carnivores have compared to an animal that only eats plants or an herbivore? So we talk a little bit about that. Here is one of my favorite wetland animals, our marsh rabbit on the left-hand side. They are just so cute. Most of the rabbits you will see if you're in Sarasota County is the eastern cottontail rabbit on the right-hand side of your screen, sorry, and your marsh rabbit is on your left. Our eastern cottontails can be around wetland areas, but they like drier areas. They're the ones you're gonna see in your yard, in your neighborhoods. Our marsh rabbits are more in those watery wetland environments and they can actually swim. So the weirdest thing is when you're out kayaking and all of a sudden a rabbit just swims right by your canoe or kayak. It is the funniest thing to see. And our marsh rabbits do not have those little white tails. They tend to be smaller, darker, and you can see their ears are smaller too. That's how you can start to learn them apart from the cottontails, which are more common. I was down in Sanibel recently, and Sanibel being an island, most of the rabbits you see on Sanibel are actually marsh rabbits. So that's a great place if you want to see these cute little marsh rabbits. River otters are what we call an obligate wetland species, so they need to be in wetland environments, and they are a voracious carnivore. So I do actually have an otter skull that we look at in class, and their teeth are just sharp and really just amazing, just like some of our other larger predators like a panther or something like that. They just, river otters, as cute as they are voracious and aggressive predators when they're going after food. And then I have to just show you a picture of a manatee. When we're talking about mammals, they are our aquatic mammal here in Florida. They aren't really considered so much a freshwater species because they're generally in the coastal or marine environments. But of course, we all know if we live in Florida, we know a lot about our manatees. We know that when the marine waters get colder, our Florida manatees will come into our rivers and our spring areas, which is a great opportunity to see them. And they're just such a wonderful, sweet species. Okay, so I am going to take about 5 more minutes of your time talking, and then we're going to do Q&A. I'm going to talk very briefly about invasive species, and then we're going to finish up with talking about the Florida Master Naturalist Program and our class here in Sarasota. So invasive species are an issue in all of our environments here in Florida. It's not a unique issue to our freshwater environments, but I'm going to highlight quickly some of the plants and animals that are invasive in our wetland or freshwater environments. Invasive means that they were not historically here in Florida. They somehow got brought here to Florida and released. and they are actually causing a problem to our environment, our economy, or even our own human health. So, here we go. Torpedo grass, really common one that you'll see. I was kayaking, I think it was along North Creek, which is down in the Osprey area. And I kayaked up into North Creek, and there's people's houses along the edge of that creek, and there was torpedo grass that was just growing right down and right into the water, and in some places was well out into the creek. And it's a narrow creek when you get closer up to the top of it. And in some of those areas, torpedo grass was starting to encroach all the way across the creek. So this can be a problem. I know Mayaka has a problem with it as well. So they are constantly fighting some of their invasive species, as are all the state and county preserves and parks. Alligator weed is another one. I've seen this in many of our waterways in Sarasota County as well. Water hyacinth and hydrilla, I believe they both historically sort of escaped from the aquarium trade. They were being utilized as aquarium type plants. And then of course, if somebody was done with their aquarium and they just happened to dump it outside, these plants figured out that they could live really well here in Florida and started to take over a lot of our freshwater ways. Our water hyacinth is, has the dubious honor of being one of our most invasive plants to be treated in this country. Water hyacinth and also another plant called water lettuce will actually cover entire waterways, which will decrease light penetration to the aquatic plants and animals in the water. It will change dissolved oxygen levels, it'll change the temperature of the water, and then of course it affects our ability to recreate in those waters and do the things that we like to do out in our natural freshwater environments. So these invasive plants are really quite an issue. Here's a couple of other ones. We just found some climbing fern. There's actually two kinds, Old World and Japanese climbing fern. We just found some in Oscar Shear, so I know they're going to be taking care of that before it encroaches too much. And Melaleuca is a large tree with sort of papery bark, very common here in Sarasota County. It doesn't belong here, but it is common. And it was brought into the Everglades to try to reduce water levels to help with land development for sugarcane plantations. And then we realized what a problem it then became. Here's the little weevil that is impacting our large air plants that I mentioned earlier. It is a non-native. We call it the evil weevil because it kills our native bromeliads. We do have a native Florida bromeliad weevil that has evolved historically with our native epiphytes. And so the native bromeliad weevil is, it occurs in low amounts and it doesn't have such an impact, whereas this other one came in probably on some other type of plant that was brought in and started to flourish here and has a much higher impact on our native plants. I'm going to skip through. I'll stop here because I know I get a lot of questions about cane toads. I've been getting a lot of identifications of people asking me if the toad or frog they find is a cane toad. We do not have a lot of them here in Sarasota County, although we have had confirmed sightings of a few. But we don't have as large a population as we do in some of our other counties. I believe, for instance, Hillsborough and Pinellas have a pretty large population. So the cane toad is the one you guys hear about on the news. It has, as you can see in this picture, these really large glands that harbor this viscous toxin that can impact our dogs if our dogs catch one of these. It can even impact us if we catch one and it gets on our hands. So if you ever handle them, you want to wash your hands immediately or handle them with gloves. They are quite large, so they are larger when they're full grown than any other amphibian that's native to our area. They can get as large as like a dinner plate. So sometimes that's how we can identify them by size. Our Cuban tree frogs, also an invasive species. We have often tons of these around our houses, but they are also detrimental to the balance of our native ecosystems. All right, I'm going to skip through lizards. I'll just say a word about Burmese pythons. We're a little bit too far north so far for Burmese pythons to get here, although they are starting to expand their northern range. I recently did an interview about the research that some of our UF professors have been doing on a parasite that is, the parasite coexists with the Burmese python in its native range of Asia, but the parasite came over here when the Burmese pythons came over here. And what has now been found is not only is the Burmese python a serious issue, but this parasite is also now infecting our native snakes and affecting their immunity and their ability to survive. So not only is the snake, the Burmese python itself a problem, but then this parasite that came with it is another problem to our native ecosystems. It's just fascinating when you start looking at these non-native invasives and how they impact our ecosystems. All right, here we go. We're going to finish this up. Our Florida Master Naturalist program, if you haven't ever taken a class, it is a wonderful, wonderful program. These are the people up in Gainesville that manage the program, and then we have instructors all throughout our state in many different counties. You can take a class in any county you want. You can take the classes in any order you want. We have multiple instructors here in Sarasota, some at Moat Marine Lab, and then of course, some of us here at IFAS Extension. The mission of the program is to increase awareness, understanding, and respect of Florida's natural world among Florida's citizens and visitors. We like to teach those who are going to teach others about the amazingness of our Florida ecosystems. There's 3 core modules. These are the longer classes. They're 40 hours each. And each of these core modules focuses on a specific ecosystem. We just did a brief run through of the freshwater class, which when you take that class, you get a book that's like, I think it's over 200 pages and there's 12 different chapters in it. I just condensed that into like a little over an hour. You can see how hard that was for me. So here are the 3 different core modules. We of course talked about freshwater and we covered marshes, swamps, and skipped over lakes, rivers, and springs for a different time. There are also 4 special topics. These are shorter courses. They're 24 hours in length and they focus on sort of a specific skill set. So for instance, we're going to be teaching environmental interpretation starting at the end of this month. And that class is a 24-hour class that helps you to learn how to interpret the environment for others, like how to give a guided walk or how to do one of these PowerPoint presentations. Wildlife monitoring teaches you some of the skills that wildlife biologists use to monitor wildlife populations. So they're each like a little unique subset of skills, and they're very fun. And then there's a couple restoration courses that you see in the middle there. Our marine habitat one is new. I'm not sure if we've taught it yet. We haven't taught it here, but I'm not sure if it's being taught in the state yet, but soon if it isn't currently being taught. And they also are in the process of developing an invasive species special topic too. So a whole class just on invasive plants. So as I said, all of these courses are available. You can register in whatever county you want to register in. Currently, because of our COVID situation, these classes are being taught virtually online. So we are having students register from even states outside of Florida, and also different counties. So take the opportunity to maybe take one of these classes that you weren't able to take previously, but now they're online and you don't necessarily have to leave your home to be able to take them. We still are trying to make them really fun and interactive. We're still having you do like little mini field trips on your own in a situation that you feel safe in, because currently we're not able to take you on field trips. And just here are some pictures of some of our freshwater classes in the past. This is at Myakka. We're looking at the floodplain of the Myakka River with one of their park rangers. Here we have just hiked into the dry prairie, which is more of an upland ecosystem, but in the dry prairie in Myakka, there are depressional wetlands. So we had just hiked into the prairie to find that wetland that had those carnivorous plants in it. Here we are at a HOA community in the Palmer Ranch area of Sarasota County, Stony Brook Golf and Country Club. They are doing amazing things to restore their wetlands and also to make their stormwater retention ponds a little bit more natural. So this is the gentleman, Forrest Crook, who oversees all of that restoration at Stony Brook, and he does a field trip for our class, and we go through all these different places and what he's done. Here we are with a freshwater invertebrate specialist, Dr. Barber, doing dip netting right here at our office, where we're pulling those invertebrates out and then looking at them under microscopes and identifying all those cool little things living out there in Twin Lakes. Oh, sometimes we have special visitors to our classes too. Here's Wilma, who is our Florida Friendly Landscaping Specialist at our office, but she also loves snakes, and this is her snake Maisie. So she came in and talked to our class about freshwater snakes, but also brought in Maisie. Here we are checking the PVC pipes for frogs in the wetland at Oscar Shear. This is Dr. Abby right here. And she's actually looking, it's hard to see, but she's looking into a PVC pipe that's placed in that wetland to see if there's a frog or two in there. Here's a group from one of our classes doing their final project. In the core modules, you do a final group project where you synthesize what you've learned into like a 15 or 20-minute presentation. They did theirs on freshwater reptiles, and you can see they made snake puppets out of socks and had stuffed animals, and it was really fun. Here's another one of the projects where this is actually a middle school and high school science teacher, and he taught us how to make your own aquifer. Here's one of our graduating classes. And there we go. So I know that was a whirlwind. So thank you for staying with us through all of that. We're going to have some Q&A time. And also we have a survey that before you leave, we'd love it if you would complete. Cassidy is going to put the link to the survey in the chat box. So you'll be able to go to your chat box and then just click on the link, and it's about 7 questions. It should take you like 1 or 2 minutes to complete. So please take our survey and let me know how we did today. There is my email address, so if you have to leave or you come up with a question later in the future, please feel free to just reach out to me if you have any questions.